from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight, the impasse gripping Washington.
We have a lot of things that we're going to eliminate and permanently eliminate. You know, one of the things that we have is some advantage, you could say, but because of the shutdown, which I think they made a big mistake, we're able to take out billions and billions of dollars of waste, fraud, and abuse, and they've handed it, on a silver platter.
The threat coming from the administration as the president seeks to put pressure on lawmakers to reopen the government. The Senate poised for more votes on Democratic and Republican funding bills as soon as tomorrow, while inaction in the House characterizing part of the narrative around the shutdown standoff. We'll have new reporting on the developments from Capitol Hill and the White House and what may happen next when we speak with Republican Senators Rand Paul and James Lankford. Plus, as the president meets with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney today at the White House, the state of play on tariffs, the potential renegotiation of the USMCA, and a lot more. And are Americans already feeling the shutdown's impact? Reports from airports around the country as flight delays pile up amid staffing shortages and lack of pay stemming from the government closure. We begin this evening with the ongoing government shutdown, with no progress seeming to be occurring on either side of the aisle this evening and no votes on reopening the government today. Here's House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries and the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, today discussing one of the major sticking points here, of course, the extension of Affordable Care Act subsidies. Listen.
We're talking about everyday Americans. And they only get a one-year extension? Like, what world are these MAGA extremists living in right now? To think that Democrats are going to go along with a one-year extension from a group of people, meaning the Republicans, who just permanently extended massive tax breaks for their billionaire donors. It's a laughable proposition.
This is a very complicated issue. It's not a simple one. And you have, as I mentioned, there's probably 400 different ideas on the table of how to modify, change, or improve that if it is indeed going to be extended. And there's lots of concern all the way around. But there's no way that if four of us can go in a room and just snap our fingers and say, oh, here's the solution, let's get it done. We haven't had time to do that.
Bloomberg's Erik Wasson still standing post on Capitol Hill covering the shutdown for us and with us now live from the Hill. Erik, it doesn't feel like we're any closer today than we were yesterday. Could we be further apart?
You know, it really is a deepening impasse. A lot of the day was spent litigating various leaks from the White House Budget Office. The White House Budget Office claiming it may not need to pay furloughed federal workers back pay. Sources here on both sides of the aisle question the legality of that. Congress, on a bipartisan basis in 2019, passed a law saying that furloughed workers would need back pay. But then again, the White House Budget Office has stretched the meaning of the law when it comes to appropriations. Also, questions remaining about the legality of firing. We heard that clip from the president talking about the ability to unilaterally fire federal workers, but that may also violate appropriations law. Meanwhile, as we heard in the other clips, the leaders are pretty far apart on this idea of Obamacare. Some House moderates in both parties, Republicans and Democrats, filed a one-year extension, and then Jeffries came out and said that wouldn't be good enough. They're looking at a permanent extension costing upwards of $350 billion, and that's their starting point. On the other hand, Republicans, when they talk about the Affordable Care Act, talk about maybe going in and redoing the whole thing, reopening this whole repeal and replace notion that failed in 2017. So even if we get beyond this current shutdown, any talks on the ACA will be very heated this fall.
We thought there'd be votes every day on the two CRs. That was at least the plan from John Thune as we rounded out last week, Erik. Why no votes today? Does it tell us anything about what's happening?
Well, Hakeem Jeffries called it legislative insanity to keep doing the same thing again and again. I think there might be some strategy here of trying to see if the heat builds on Democrats, if any, sort of background talks that are going on among rank and file Democrats. Gary Peters telling us, he's heard from Republicans. So we know that Susan Collins is trying to broker a deal. But so far, the sort of, white paper that they're putting forward is more about promises and eventual commitments to do appropriations bills, to do a deal on Obamacare, where Democrats are saying that's just not good enough. We need, a concrete proposal. We need to have something inserted in this legislation that actually fixes the problem. So they're really nowhere. But I guess they're just taking a pause tonight as Groundhog Day takes a one-day break.
Yeah, got it. Bloomberg's Erik Wasson live on Capitol Hill. Thank you, Erik. Just before this program, I sat down with Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, the lone Republican who has consistently voted against both Republican and Democratic spending bills that would reopen the government. He's still a no. And I started by asking him if he thinks he's the last fiscal hawk in his party. Listen.
Feels that way sometimes, yeah. The way I look at the spending proposals is what amount of debt will it add up to? So the Republican plan this year, the continuing resolution, led to about a $2 trillion deficit. And I look forward to see what will it do if we do the same thing next year. It's about a $2.1 trillion deficit, so it's actually worse. Now, the Democrats are offering an alternative, but their alternative would be $3 trillion in debt. So I think neither plan is a very good plan. And so I've offered an alternative called the penny plan budget, which would take an across-the-board cut and balance the budget over about a 5-year period. It would still add some debt, but in the first year, it would probably be half of what they're looking at now.
I saw the penny plan that you posted on Twitter. What happens when you walk in the cloakroom and talk to your Republican colleagues then, Senator? What do they tell you when you try to make your case?
Well, I think they know where I'm coming from. When we had the vote 2 weeks ago, 36 Republicans voted with me. So it's not like it's a minority. Over half of my caucus voted with me. Now, there's still 16 big government Republicans who don't want to cut any spending. And typically they work with the big government Democrats, and it is a bipartisan spending problem that we have here. But most of them, I think, wish that they could be better and stronger. But I think a lot of them think, well, I can't stake out this position. But when I get home, I get nothing but encouragement. People at home are like, thank you for standing your ground. Thank you for standing up for what you said you were running on, which was balancing the budget.
Yeah. Are people at home talking to you about health care as well, the extent to which there's concern about Obamacare subsidies expiring at the end of the year? This is the talk, and the president says that he's in discussions with Democrats about this. Is that the off-ramp?
Most of our conversations at home have been with people affected by tariffs. So the number one issue I get wherever I go in the state is tariffs are killing the family farm, tariffs are killing the bourbon industry, tariff is killing the cargo transport industry. So there's all kinds of talk, but mostly of tariffs. On the idea of health care, I hear mostly from small businesses that are not in the Obamacare exchange, but feel like they don't have the leverage to get a good price. So what I've been offering for years for people who are worried about the price of health care is I'd like to let people buy it through an entity like Costco, which has 44 million members. I'd like to make it legal for you just to go Costco, and then somebody from Costco would negotiate for 44 million members and have the leverage to drive prices down. It's that individual market of small businessmen and women who have trouble with the health insurance. Then there's the whole government subsidy part. But the reason you can't just give everybody money is we don't have the money to give to them. We have to borrow it from China. That leads to inflation, and poor people think they're getting something free on one hand, but the other hand's in their pocket, stealing their paycheck with inflation.
Well, of course, that's what Chuck Schumer is calling for, and Democrats, they want to have a negotiation over these subsidies. When you hear Schumer shut down, and it's almost a drinking game around here at this point, Senator, we hear that every day from Republicans who join us. Is that a disingenuous line when it comes to describing this situation? Is it more complicated than that, or actually how you see it from the other side of the aisle?
I would say a lot of people are at fault for devolving this debate down to maybe a third grade level and not really thinking it through. The vote isn't on shutting government down or keeping government open. The vote is on what level of spending can you tolerate, what level of debt can you tolerate, and I think there can be valid reasons. Now, the reason why I think the Democrats are less valid at this point are because 48 of them voted, or 47 of them voted in December of last year for the identical bill. See, we're still living under the Biden spending levels. That's why I'm opposed to it. I voted against the Biden spending levels when they came from Democrats and when they're coming from Republicans. But these Democrats voted for the identical bill in December of 24. They're faced with the exact same vote now, and they've changed. Why? Because they've moved the goalpost. This whole idea of Obamacare subsidies has never been a part of the continuing resolution debate. It's something the Democrats put forward, is expiring because the Democrats allowed it to expire in their own legislation. So there's a bit of disingenuousness on their part.
Well, it is interesting as well. You didn't mention AOC, which usually comes with the talking points on this, and it is rich irony, Senator, that Republicans are now urging Democrats to vote on this bill that they once found toxic, and I guess this is why a lot of people have trouble understanding Washington here. What's your gut? Just before we move on, I'd like to ask you about a couple of other things. Does the government set a new record for shutdowns here, and is the president applying pressure on you?
No, I think it lasts a few more days. The Democrats have to put on a show for their left wing. So the socialist wing of the party is hitting them, saying they don't stand up for, government subsidies, for government welfare strong enough. So I think there's a rally this weekend in Washington. The rumor is the Democrats have to put on a show through the rally. Once they've made it through the rally and the left wing doesn't come after and eat their own, then they'll capitulate and say that they want a deal and they'll open the government.
You're still a no, though, right?
Yeah, I'm a no because I've been a no against the spending levels, but I'm a no for different reasons, not for partisan reasons, not for anything to do with the Obamacare subsidies. I'm a no because both the Republican and Democrat plan offer us too much debt.
I want to ask you about what's going on in the Caribbean, Senator Rand Paul, and specifically when it comes to Venezuela. And you've been outspoken about this. You commented around fears of extrajudicial killings following the first boat. We've now had 4. Your concern about the president's actions here, is he looking for regime change in Venezuela?
I don't know, but we did discover today that the Coast Guard, when they interdict boats, it's a common thing off the coast of Miami and California. Yeah. About 25% of the time, the boat that they board doesn't have drugs on it. So they have made an error, but they don't kill them. But we've blown up 4 boats now, and if the percentages hold true, did one of those 4 boats not have drug dealers on it? If they all had drug dealers on it, the first 11 they killed, what were their names? What was the evidence linking them to being part of a gang? So I think there's a lot of unknowns here, and I don't think you can have a universal Coast Guard policy of just blowing up boats before they're interdicted. There's, decades-long history of how we board boats. We say, halt, stop, we will board your boat. If they don't halt and stop, there's an escalation of use of force. But we don't just blow ships up. So there is a real problem, and yes, I think it might lead to regime change. And some of the more skeptical among us think that maybe this is a provocation to lead to real regime change, a provocation to get the Venezuelans to react so we can then insert the military. I hope that's not true.
Well, I know you're very familiar with these rules as chairman of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, and there's been a question more recently about whether there's a congressional answer to this. Would you support a War Powers Act with eyes on Venezuela?
Yes, I will co-sponsor the War Powers Act later this week, and we will be discussing this on the floor. I think it's one of the most important debates we have. And the idea that you can kill someone who you don't know their name and has had no process at all. People say, oh, you're going to give due process to fentanyl killers and all of this. Even in our country, 20,000 people commit murders, and as angry as we are, if it were my family, I would, want to shoot them. But we still have trials because occasionally the accused is found innocent and not guilty. Occasionally we make mistakes, but we can't have a policy where we just blow up ships where we don't even know the people's names. It can't be the policy for drug interdiction, either in the country or outside the country. So I will support a war resolution to say the government shouldn't be doing this.
Well, that's news, Senator, and really interesting that you're going to put your name on this. Do you have other Republicans who will support that legislation?
There will be people quietly who will say it's the right thing to do and will respect me for doing the right thing. I think most will be afraid of the response from the White House.
The president just announced a stake in Trilogy Metals now. This is the 4th company, by my count, with a true government equity stake. There's also the golden share when it comes to U.S. Steel. Is there any position in which you would support these moves? Is MP Materials, for instance, an exemption in the name of national security? Are we going down the wrong road here? You've called this a step towards socialism. Now that we have more companies, are we ever closer?
I wrote a book called The Case Against Socialism, and so I'm not for government ownership of the means of production, but I'm also not for the government owning 10% of the means of production. They're all various forms and degrees of socialism. I do think that the law also, the statute that gave money to these companies, I was against it because I'm against subsidies, particularly when we have to borrow them. But the law didn't indicate any power or transfer any power to the president to say instead of a grant, we're going to have stock in your company, and that's the only way you get it. Those conditions weren't contemplated in the law, so I suspect eventually this will go to court. I've been surprised how quickly the companies have acquiesced in it, but I guess it is free money from their perspective. And when you get free money, it's hard to turn away from that. But no, I don't like it. I don't like the government sort of saying to NVIDIA, hey guys, yeah, you can sell in China this year, but we want 15%. You know, we want 15%. There is no legal authority to do things like that. And, you know, my problem is, imagine what this would be like if you had Mondami as president or AOC as president. There's my talking point. It came back in. If AOC were president, can you imagine what would it mean for her to own the companies? What if she owned 10% of Exxon? What if she owned 10% of the oil companies? Oh, my goodness. So I don't want Republicans or Democrats to own the companies. It's a terrible idea.
Duly noted. When you think about what we're discussing here, though, socialism with regard to government stakes, in publicly traded companies. In the case of Intel, you've got Trilogy Metals now. We can talk about TikTok and the integrity of Congress, authoritarianism when it comes to extrajudicial killings off Venezuela. We've all done this in just 10 minutes, Senator. So is Donald Trump an autocrat?
Well, the interesting thing is, despite my complaints, despite my pushback, I still think he's the best president of our lifetime, frankly. I would vote for him a million times over a socialist like Harris or a president like Biden, who is unable to really perform the functions of the job. But yeah, on so many things, he's for lower taxes, less regulation. He's more pro-business. Doesn't mean I agree with everything, but just because I have disagreements, and some of the things are big disagreements, doesn't mean that I actually, frankly, don't think he's a great president.
You think federal workers should get back pay when this ends?
They always do. It's not a matter of will they. They always do, and it'll be part of the deal. The Democrats will fold within a week, but part of the deal is that all the union workers that work for the federal government will get back pay.
Republican Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky talking with us earlier today. He remains a no vote on this day 7 of the government shutdown. Make sure to tune in, by the way, this time tomorrow for our extended conversation with House Speaker Mike Johnson, the shutdown, the blame game in Washington, and what, if anything, can break the impasse. That'll be only here on Balance of Power tomorrow. And coming up, we'll continue our coverage of the government shutdown with Republican Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma. First, though, today marking 2 years since the October 7th attacks in Israel. We'll discuss the state of the war in Gaza as the latest round of talks continue in Egypt with Mara Rudman, former State Department official, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
On this solemn day of commemoration of the horrific attacks of October 7th, for the first time in decades, hundreds of years, thousands of years, this prospect of peace that you've made possible. Canada stands foursquare behind those efforts, and we'll do whatever we can to support them.
Very nice. Yeah. Thank you very much.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for joining us. That was earlier today in the Oval Office. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney alongside President Trump in front of the fireplace. Of course, the pair noting the 2-year mark since the October 7th attacks in Israel that ignited the war in Gaza. Israelis could be seen throughout the day visiting vigils honoring the victims of the attacks at what was the Nova Music Festival memorial site in southern Israel, as pro-Palestinian protesters could be seen and heard demonstrating in the streets of London, calling for an end to the conflict. Now, Israel and Hamas are continuing their indirect talks in Egypt in the latest push to reach a ceasefire deal. And with us now for more in our Washington bureau, Mara Rudman, professor at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, former Deputy Envoy for Middle East Peace at the U.S. State Department. It's great to see you, Mara, and I'm sorry it's not for better reasons today, but I wonder what this 2-year mark means for negotiations underway in Cairo, if it heightens the urgency or, in fact, complicates this conversation.
I think it can only heighten the urgency in the sense that it's 2 years since those hostages who are still alive have been under horrendous conditions in Gaza, and nearly 2 years of very, very difficult conditions for the many Palestinians in Gaza who are not affiliated with Hamas, who do not wish to be affiliated with Hamas, and who have really had their lives devastated.
There's, of course, a lot of question about what's going to come from this, and many folks thought there was a deal in place last week when it was announced by the president and Benjamin Netanyahu. How close are we to realizing the elements in this 20-point plan?
So I think it's important to distinguish. I know President Trump's statements were very much that the deal was done.
Yeah.
The deal was rolled out, I would say, at the White House last week. And the 20-point plan is an impressive one. I don't think it's a plan that Prime Minister Netanyahu was thrilled about, but I think so many Israelis in the streets, his military, his security folks all very much support it, as do many, many Palestinians. So I think there's a great deal of pressure moving in on those who've been hardliners in Israel, and Hamas is nothing but hardliners, to come to agreement on this.
Well, to that end, the point has been made that Hamas is essentially being asked to sign its own death warrant at the negotiating table, that it will cease to exist as it is currently known or any form following this point. Is that the case? Will Hamas's political leaders in Qatar have to go into hiding or be part of some new transitionary government?
So, Joe, those are good points. I would guess those are things that are being negotiated. Mm-hmm. What is clear from the 20-point plan is that Hamas will no longer be a military force, that it would be, all of its arms would be decommissioned. It would have no role in the future governance of Gaza. I think there are open questions, frankly, on how much it was governing Gaza before versus having it very military. They didn't care about the Palestinians who lived in Gaza. Mm-hmm. But so it's very clear under the 20-point plan that that's the case. You can't wipe out an ideology. And there are certainly many newer members of Hamas that have come to be, younger generations, sadly, since October 7th as well, in Gaza. Mm-hmm. Still a far minority. But so what happens to and with them, I think, is difficult for an agreement itself to determine. Yeah.
When we start considering the withdrawal of Israeli forces, balancing that with the release or exchange of hostages, do these need to coincide with one another? If you're at the negotiating table, how do you get to such sensitive issues, specifically when it comes to the handing over of hostages?
So listen, details matter. Yeah. And what the 20-point plan that President Trump rolled out, I believe is an impressive plan, but it's a framework. And so what is being discussed now are the details. And I would also suspect that many of those who worked on developing those 20 points. I think Jared Kushner is among them. I think Tony Blair had a role. I think a number of the Gulf countries were involved. And it is my suspicion that they have some very detailed ideas on how those transitions occur, as do the Israeli military forces who have worked this previously.
Yeah. We've only got a minute. Is Jared Kushner actually running this negotiation for the U.S.?
I can't answer that. I mean, literally, because I do not know who is running the negotiation. I think it's clear he has an important role. I think the lack of process across the national security decision-making in this administration is a challenge. And it's part of why I can't answer that question. And there should be more transparency in who's in charge.
It's always great to talk to you. Thank you for the insights. Mara Rudman is professor at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, former Deputy Envoy for Middle East Peace at the State Department. Coming up, we'll turn back to our conversation on the ongoing government shutdown with Republican Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Look, I don't like shutdowns. I think it's just a bad idea, and I don't care what the Democrats or Republicans say. It's a bad idea. It's not a way to run a railroad. I don't think it's critical. We've had, I forgot the number, 4 or 5 or 6. You know, one of them went for 35 days. I'm not sure anyone really affected the economy and the market in a real way.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. That was J.P. Morgan Chase Chair CEO Jamie Dimon earlier today on Bloomberg, discussing the impact of the government shutdown on markets. And for a closer look at how Wall Street is responding or not to this current shutdown, we turn to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Nora Melinda, who is live at World Headquarters in New York. Not the greatest day for stocks, but it's certainly no panic here, Nora.
Not at all. Not a panic per se in sight. We are seeing indexes down across the board. You're really seeing investors taking a breather right now during this government shutdown, bearing in mind that we've been hitting all-time high after all-time high. So natural to see a pullback here. Looking at the dollar, though, the U.S. dollar rising despite being down year to date. But let's dig into some of those individual movers that we're really keeping an eye on much of the trading day. Looking at shares of Tesla. Of course, Tesla in focus today after the company decided that it was going to unveil different versions priced under $40,000 for a lot of its top-selling electric vehicles here. Shareholders, though, selling off, down about 4.5% at the closing bell here, Joe. Another name in the red that we were keeping an eye on throughout the trading day is shares of Oracle. This company down after a report from the information here that Oracle will actually be seeing cloud computing business is seeing a profit margin that came in lower than expected here. Of course, we do know the stock is up about 70% year to date, so just contextualizing that here for you. Shares down about 2.5% at the closing bell. And lastly, a name that is in the green, looking at shares of Dell Technologies, actually finishing the day at its highest level in over a year here. This, of course, after the company doubled its growth estimates for both profit and sales for over the next 2 years. This, of course, citing demand, particularly from AI demand here from a lot of its users. Shares up about 3.5% at the closing bell. Also looking into the land of the bond market, we did see bonds pulling back a tad here. If you take a look at the trading day, you are seeing the 2-year yield up just a touch here, 10-year, take a look at that, and 30-year just up a touch here, ending at 4.7% for that yield here, Joe.
So, Nora, give me a sense of when we start to worry about a lack of data. It was a pretty weird Friday without the jobs report hitting at 8:30 a.m. A lot of investors are looking toward private research, but when does this start to hang over stock prices?
Right. I mean, Friday, of course, as you mentioned, the first Friday of the month is typically the day that we see the jobs report. It is a jobs Friday. But of course, this past Friday, there was no data here in sight, especially as we see us entering the 7th day here of the government shutdown. For investors, you're looking for places of stability here. So you're going to see a lot of people looking at any sort of metrics possible, with a lot of other private data points being used to kind of figure out what the Fed will do next, because especially that is what most people have in focus with the next Fed meeting planned for later this month. Joe.
Bloomberg's Nora Melinda in New York. Thank you so much, Nora, for the readout on this. And as the government shutdown drags on, President Trump is reiterating his threat of mass layoffs in the coming days. Take a listen.
We have a lot of things that we're going to eliminate and permanently eliminate. You know, one of the things that we have is some advantage, you could say, but because of the shutdown, which I think they made a big mistake, we're able to take out billions and billions of dollars of waste, fraud, and abuse, and they've handed it, on a silver platter.
Joining us now live from Capitol Hill as we continue our conversation on day 7, Republican Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma, member of the Senate Finance and Homeland Security Committee. Senator, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg TV and radio. As we wait for some action, and I realize you're not going to be voting, we understand, on the CRs today, that you'll get back most likely tomorrow on this. What's your thought on the president's ideas here on using this as an opportunity to limit the size and scale of government? Should that be the conversation now?
I think it should be the conversation at any point. Obviously, September the 30th, there were 150,000 federal employees that ended their connection to the federal government. Those are the folks that were given the opportunity to be early out. Through the early months of the Trump administration, said you could stay on till September the 30th. So we had 150,000 employees that left at that point. What the president's doing now is he's basically sorting in every agency to say if they're considered essential or non-essential. If they're considered non-essential, then there's a second look to say if they're non-essential now in the shutdown, are they non-essential long-term on that? That should be a reasonable thing any business would do. The federal government's no different than any business if you want to be able to take a hard look at it and say if we can function without them, should we? Is that the right thing to be able to do, and then to be able to make the wise decision from there?
Interesting. Got it. But in that case, they would not be rehired. These would be permanent layoffs we're talking about.
Well, the president has not announced. That's what they've implied initially on this, what Russ Vought has talked about from the Office of Management and Budget, but he's not actually given any clear instructions of what they would do long term. But this gives them the opportunity to be able to look at that. They've still got to make the decision on it.
He also was asked today in the Oval Office about back pay. This was an idea floated by the Office of Management and Budget that not all federal employees deserve back pay. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, talked about that earlier. We followed up with the president on that, who said that some people don't deserve to be cared for, but he wouldn't identify who they are. Should Congress reinforce the laws on the books about federal workers receiving back pay when the government reopens?
Yeah, we've had pretty clear federal law on this, that if we have a shutdown on it and you were furloughed and you're coming back, that you do get back pay on it. That's something that's happened, obviously not the decision of any federal worker. By the way, that's why I've worked so hard as a member of Congress. I have a bill called Preventing Government Shutdowns. We had 56 votes for last time. We need 60 to get it done, that we would permanently end any government shutdowns, because federal workers and their families and members of the military and their families should not be the ones paying the consequences for a government shutdown. It should be members of Congress that actually have the impact if we don't get our work done. That's a different issue. But for me, yes, they should get back pay. Who doesn't get back pay are contractors. Now, there are contractors in some of those janitorial services and food services and other things that are in a lot of these federal buildings. They're just not used during this time period. And many of those contractors will never receive back pay and never have. So there are some pretty vulnerable individuals that are vulnerable during this time period.
I know there are a lot of ancillary businesses around here that are feeling this, Senator, and you're right to point that out. We spoke earlier this hour with your colleague Rand Paul of Kentucky, and of course, you well know he's the lone holdout on the Republican side of the aisle, a no vote, pointing to not to associate himself with Democrats, but what he calls increased debt and deficit. Why is he wrong in this case?
Well, right now we're fighting just to be able to keep the government open to continue the negotiations on this. I understand he's saying this is still an extension of the Biden budget before. And so he just says we need to have a much lower spending level on it. So he votes against every continuing resolution, saying, "Hey, I'll vote on it if we have much lower." The challenge that we have is we don't have 60 votes. We're not even close to that. So the alternative then is to just keep the government closed down forever. That doesn't help us either. We've got to actually have conversations with Republicans, Democrats who disagree on a lot of things, figure out how we can get 60 votes in the Senate to agree to something and then to be able to move. That's why it's so surprising. During the Biden administration, all 4 Septembers, we had a continuing resolution during this time period as well, kept the government open while we continued negotiation. That was not an issue. But when President Trump comes, Democrats are now saying we're just going to shut the government down, not negotiate. That doesn't help us.
Well, Senator Lankford, whether it's now or when the government reopens, there'll have to be a negotiation at some point. The president indicated yesterday that talks with Democrats were underway, at least on an informal level, on extending Obamacare subsidies with maybe some new guardrails around it. You know a lot about making deals, Senator, and we watched you put, I think, 4 to 6 months of your life into a very important bipartisan deal on the border that the president then turned away from. This was last year, of course. Before he was in office, candidate Donald Trump affected the outcome there, and I know you don't need me to tell you. What would be different this time? Would you lead a gang to help negotiate something on health care, or would you have advice for others who are?
Well, I would say first and foremost, we got to have the president, the House, and the Senate all on the same page to be able to work through that. At that time, I was trying to be able to navigate a situation where I had a Democrat president and I had a Republican House and a Democrat Senate, and trying to be able to figure out how do we actually solve this intransigent issue of open borders with a president that did not want to close the borders. So it's a very different issue at this point. Now that we have a president that does want to be able to solve this, the problem of the budget, we have the House and the Senate that do want to be able to solve this. We've got to be able to figure out how to be able to navigate it. Now, there are a couple things on the Obamacare subsidies. The Obamacare subsidies, the base level, are not in the argument. These are plus-ups that were done during COVID. And this is what a lot of my Democrat colleagues are trying to conflate. It's not the base subsidies being talked about. This was the temporary plus-ups for COVID that they're trying to say they now want to make permanent. That's a very different issue.
No, you're right to point that out, and we've tried to make that delineation when we talk about it as well, Senator. So that begs another question. Should they be sunset altogether? We're not in a pandemic right now. Do you fade this out after a year? Because Democrats want a permanent extension.
Right. Democrats actually put that in during the Inflation Reduction Act. They said this was temporary for a health emergency and were sunsetting it at the end of 2025. So it already has a sunset. It was set there by Democrats when they said this is only for the pandemic time period. And now they're saying, just kidding, I want to be able to make that permanent. The difficult question is, the Affordable Care Act is either not affordable because they continue to need more and more subsidies on it, or it drives up everyone's insurance cost. So we got to figure this out. It's one of the things the president has said is he wants to go back and look at what is systemically driving up the rates this way. We can't just keep pouring more money into it over and over and say the way that we make it more affordable is more tax subsidies.
Yeah, I took a look at your state of Oklahoma. I see 277,000 enrollees in the Affordable Care Act. I don't know how many of those have the extended subsidies, but would you want to tell them that there's a definite period of time they can count on this, or let it expire at the end of the year?
Yeah, they've got to have some clarity. Right now, all the insurance rates are coming out already November the 1st. Every insurance company is already assuming the expiration because by law the expiration is there. And so those rates are coming out. And what some of my Democratic colleagues are trying to say, well, the rates are going to go up unless we do this. What they're not saying is the rates are already going up on everybody else just on the structure of the Affordable Care Act, which is pushing rates up over and over and over again. So even if these subsidies were put in place, even if they were maintained, rates are still going up significantly. It's not just because of the subsidies. Subsidies would offset a portion of that, but the rates are already going up, everybody, just because of the structural problem in the law.
Well, this is a conversation that is not going to end anytime soon, I'm sure, Senator. And while you're with us, I'd like to ask you, from your perch on the Homeland Security Committee and on Intel, Rand Paul also told us he's going to be introducing and co-sponsoring a War Powers Act later this week in response to the administration's efforts to blow up alleged cartel shipments coming out of Venezuela. Is that something you would sign on to?
Well, I've got to be able to read it. I can tell you we have a serious drug issue in the United States. We've done interdiction for a long time, and the count is still coming at us. That's increasing. So securing the land border is helping, but a lot of those drugs are now hitting the Pacific and the Atlantic and coming right at the United States. So we had 100,000 Americans lost to drug overdose. We've got to find a way to be able to attack the incoming supply, as we're also dealing with treatment for individuals to help them break that addiction as well.
You worry about blowing up boats without knowing who's on them?
We better know who's on them, and I would tell you from the intelligence gathering and everything else, these are not cruise ships. These are not individuals out on a pleasure fishing trip on it. These are individuals that are interdicting drugs into the United States to kill Americans.
Republican Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma. It's good to have you back on Bloomberg, sir. Thanks for the time. Coming up, we'll continue our conversation on the impact of the government shutdown with our political panel. We'll talk as well about how the aviation industry is already feeling the impact. You may be sitting on a runway right now. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington as we keep our eyes on Reagan National Airport here in the nation's capital. If you're delayed on an aircraft and listening to or watching Bloomberg, we feel you. As we enter the 7th day of this government shutdown, there does seem to be very little that could move lawmakers toward a compromise. Many Americans may have already started to feel the impact of the closure in this form, with flight delays piling up in recent days, all due to already short-staffed air traffic controllers now working without pay. Pending a solution in Washington. For a look specifically at how this is impacting the airline sector, we turn to Bloomberg's global aviation chief correspondent, Phillip, who's live at World Headquarters in New York. Hundreds of flights delayed. Sid, how bad could this get?
I mean, we still don't know how bad it could get, but I mean, at the moment, even though the FAA and the air traffic control staff are classified as essential, they aren't getting paid until the shutdown ends and they can actually start getting a paycheck. So we've seen anecdotal reports of the fact that the air traffic controllers are calling in sick, and that's sort of causing delays across the country. So we've seen the FAA put out advisories for Nashville Airport, warning of long delays, 125 minutes. We've seen Chicago, 41 minutes, and Dallas, Fort Worth. So essentially, these are very important hubs for America, and until they can actually get these air traffic controllers back in the towers and actually get planes sort of moving, even at the sort of slower and shortage. I mean, there's already a shortage of air traffic controllers in this country, and so this sort of further creates a further problem for the industry. And I'm sure the airlines are hoping that they can actually get staffing back to the levels they saw previously, just so that they can get aircraft quicker on the ground and they don't have to face the delays.
Well, just quickly, Sid, are we hearing from the unions? Are they calling for sick outs or protest, or everyone's working 60 hours a week for no pay?
The unions haven't said a whole lot just yet, but we're waiting to see what they comment on this. I mean, they will, I'm sure, have comments on this shortly, especially if this carries on any longer.
Bloomberg's Sid Phillip in New York. Thanks for your coverage, Sid, and for joining us this evening. As we turn to our panel now for their reaction, this evening's political panel includes Lester Munson, Republican strategist, principal of the international practice at BGR Group, alongside Democratic strategist Megan Hayes, former special assistant to President Biden. Great to see you both, and welcome back. You're flying home tomorrow.
Yeah, this better be solved by then.
Yeah, right. We'll have it fixed by the morning. This is the kind of thing they say gas prices are the most effective poll. It's the thing that is right in front of consumers' eyes every day. This would be another version of that, right? This reminds us that the government is not functioning.
Yeah, I think so. People are already not thrilled about having to deal with the glamour of air travel on a good day. So adding to the pain, I think, is going to be something that could drive us towards a solution on the shutdown. Also, the pending payroll payments that are going to be delayed for the military, for civilians. I think it's going to start adding up pretty quickly here.
October 10th is the next pay cycle for feds, 15th for military. Those have been looked at as inflection points. Megan, I don't know if that dislodges any Democratic votes, because I keep hearing that some might be pulling back. There's no vote, by the way, on the CRs today. Angus King was suggesting he might not be a yes anymore. Is this actually getting worse with time?
I mean, I think that the lack of just utter involvement from Republicans to negotiate is a huge problem for Democrats. They're not even showing in good faith that they want to negotiate on these health care subsidies. It is a sticking point for them. You saw that Mike Johnson sent the caucus home for this whole week, so now they're in their districts on vacation or doing district work. But I think that's part of the issue here. The Republicans are really dug in to reopen the government without any negotiation power, and I think Democrats are sort of like, okay, fine, then we're just going to sit here and wait for you to come to the table.
Yeah. The president said 4 or 5 days. I don't know why we're picking that number. He would make a decision on permanent layoffs. That might be the 10th. Maybe he has in mind. Rand Paul suggested earlier this hour Democrats cave in a week. He's wrong?
I mean, I don't know if he's wrong, but I do know that Donald Trump deciding to lay off people during a furlough is illegal. I know that he doesn't believe in the rule of law, but it is actually illegal, so that will be overturned when he does actually do that. Other democracy forums and other organizations have already sued on this threat in general. Right. So I'm not exactly sure. I think this is one of those things where he throws out a nice day and then it passes and then we all go back and he throws out another day. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I hope that they can get some answers to healthcare subsidies here rather quickly. People are going to start getting their notices of how much they're increasing. So I think it might be a week until they get those. I think they start coming out the end of October. So that's when I suspect this will wrap up.
Well, that might get you back home from your flight tomorrow. But I don't. Where are you on this whole thing? Is this an empty threat by the president as he's moving the goalpost a little bit on layoffs, or is Russ Vought the actual Grim Reaper as seen in the AI video?
I suspect these are, I don't want to say they're empty threats, but I think it's just an attempt to get some leverage in this negotiation, if you will, which is really less of a negotiation and more of a political show. I think at the end of the day, I don't think there's actually a lot of distance between the two parties on the policy. I think the Trump administration is very much in favor of spending money on Americans' health care. And I think if the Democrats would agree to just stop calling it Obamacare and start calling it Trump care,
we're done
he'd agree
here.
in a heartbeat.
Look, there's a lot to be said for that, I suspect. Did he mean to say what he said yesterday about being in talks with Democrats over health care? The White House walked that back a bit. Lawmakers we've talked to say they have no idea what that is.
You know, there are during a conflict there's conflict, there's rumors of conflict, there's the fog of war. I've heard similar things out of Capitol Hill, so I wouldn't dismiss it entirely. There's always communication going on between the two sides. I think it's probably wrong to call it formal negotiations, but I think they're feeling each other out.
Interesting. Rand Paul made some news. He's introducing a War Powers Act the end of this week, he says, in reaction to what's been happening in the Caribbean. We blew up a 4th boat coming out of Venezuela yesterday. Senator Lankford seemed to think we're on the right track with this, although we technically do not know who exactly is on these boats or what they're carrying. Will Congress have an answer to that? Would Democrats support this?
I mean, I'd like to see what's in the bill first. I do think we have some problems here that we're just blowing up ships off of other people's countries and boats and not knowing what's there. I think that is a problem because one of these times you may have gotten it right 1 or 2 times, but you are going to get it wrong and it is going to be a huge problem. And I don't think that we should want people blowing up ships off of our waters, even if it is international water. So it will be interesting to sort of see how that plays out. I do agree we do have a problem with drugs coming into our country and we need to figure that out. I'm not sure blowing up ships and boats is the right way to do it.
It makes for a pretty wild video. The president was asked in the Oval today about it. He said, we call them water drugs. They're drugs that come through the water, which is something that I guess we'll just leave that there. He added, there's no fishing boats. There's no boats out there, period. Is that because we're shooting at anything?
Well, would you get on a boat leaving Venezuela?
Probably not. What does that
not.
tell us about the policy, though?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I agree with Megan. I'm not sure this is, in the long run, the best policy. In the past, we've had pretty effective measures in the war on drugs when we've collaborated with nations in the region. Blowing up ships coming out of, even if it's Venezuela, which is a rogue nation, and Maduro's a big problem. That's not going to engender other folks in the region to want to help us. And so I think we should move past this and move on to something that's more collaborative, that's going to be more effective in the long run. And there are these interesting constitutional issues. Are these boats, does the president really have the authority to do that under the Constitution or as commander-in-chief, because it's a direct threat to the United States? I think Rand Paul's right to bring up these issues. There are other places where I would like to see him and other senators be more assertive about the first, the Article I branch of the government, which is where the founders invested a lot of this power.
Well, you're no stranger to Senate Foreign Relations. Should they pursue War Powers Act? It's been since Afghanistan, right?
Well, this is where I'm going to go nerd on you and say I'm not a big fan of the War Powers Act. If they want to go straight to an AUMF, an authorization for the use of military force, I think that's actually the smarter play. The War Powers Act is fraught with a whole lot of constitutional issues itself. And so I think a straight up AUMF would be my preferred method of dealing with this. I don't think the politics are ripe for that, but someone should be talking about it, and that's where we should be.
Really interesting. I asked Rand Paul if this was about regime change. Do you think that's how this ends, Megan?
I don't know what his ultimate goal is. I think that they are right, again, to want to be fighting drugs coming in. But again, it needs to be collaborative. You cannot do this all on our own. We are not. I know he wants to be a dictator, but that is not that's not how we are set up, and that's not how we want our Constitution or Congress want to go about it.
Well, everything that we've talked about here, whether it's laying off federal workers or blowing up ships off the coast of Venezuela, will likely end up in the courts. Will both of these be decided by the Supreme Court?
It's possible. The administration's been having trouble with judges appointed by President Trump. I think in part they're not wedded to the policy issue. They're more wedded to the fight. And they want to be seen as being aggressive on these issues. I don't agree with the dictator characterization. I think the president does want to look strong and wants to look like he's fighting for the American people. And he's kind of willing to drive over some of the usual lines that people wouldn't drive over to do that.
Strongman optics. Lester Munson and Megan Hayes, great conversation. Thank you both, as always. Special programming note for tomorrow. This time, you'll want to enjoy Balance of Power for our sit-down conversation with the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. The blame game in Washington, what, if anything, can break the impasse? We go to the source with you tomorrow on Balance of Power, 5 p.m. Eastern. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you back then on Bloomberg TV and radio.